And we're live. Okay. So, welcome back to the Astra interview series. I'm your host, Devam. And today we have someone I've genuinely been looking forward to talk to for a very long time now. And it's Dr. Manwei Chan. He's an aerospace engineer, MIT AeroAstro PhD, and someone who has done things that most people only read about. He spent a year almost alone at one of the most isolated areas of the world running cosmology research. He sailed across some of the most deadliest areas of the world, including the Drake Passage. He's worked in commercial space at Draper, eSpace, and Voyager Space. And he writes about the future of human presence in orbit in a way that actually makes people think. Dr. Chan, welcome to Astra. We're really thrilled to have you here.
Thanks, Devam. It's a pleasure to be on here, and I appreciate the invite to talk to your listeners.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, the agenda for today, what we're going to be talking about is what are the most recent developments in space and tech. We're going to do a little bit of digging at what you did at Antarctica, because I'm sure we would love to hear about that. We're going to also be talking about the privatization and kind of how everyone's trying to get into the space station space. We will also be talking about biorobotics, an interesting segment towards the end as well. We're going to be including the UFO files that recently have been released. Really excited for that part. I feel like it's a very hot topic right now. But before we get to all of that, I think I want to jump right in and start talking to you about this amazing experience you've had at Antarctica. So tell us a bit more about what you did and how it was like, not only doing research, but how it was like on a more human scale, being so alone, being so far away from everyone. How did it feel?
Yeah, so it was an amazing experience, one that I would definitely recommend to anyone who has the opportunity to do so. So, what I was doing there, I was a research specialist. So, I was operating the BICEP telescope, and it's one of the cosmology telescopes down at the South Pole. And the reason why it has to be there is the South Pole is an extreme environment. And in the case of cosmology, when you're looking at microwaves, you really want the best signal possible. And you can only get those in environments like the South Pole. The other place on Earth is the Atacama Desert, where I've also actually spent a year doing telescope operations. But the reason why these deserts and dry areas are great for microwave cosmology research is because one, there's less atmosphere, and that's because of the altitude, and two, because they're very dry, so they're deserts. And then you can imagine your microwave works because your food absorbs water. Your food absorbs microwave wavelengths because the water in your food gets heated up, and that's how your food warms up. So you can imagine if a microwave signal from space is coming through an atmosphere which has a lot of water, or it's a very humid area, your signal is going to be decreased. And that's why you get the best signals at the South Pole and also in the Atacama Desert. Now, working in an isolated environment, the Antarctic South Pole Station has two main seasons. The first is summer, so it's about 3 to 4 months from October to February, roughly. You can have about 150 people on station, and that's where most of the work gets done. That's when you upgrade your telescopes. That's when you fix things that have broken over the winter. And then the winter season starts from February to the next October. And that's when nothing comes in or out of the station. So you're there with about 40 people, and your job is to ensure that everything runs and no one gets into interpersonal conflicts that become detrimental to the science that you're trying to do. And that is always been some of the biggest challenges that people face on station, because unlike the communities that we normally live in, at least in more populous areas, you can imagine going to school with someone or going to work with someone that you might not like. And yeah, maybe you deal with them during the day, but in the evenings you can go home to your own place, your own family, your own friends, and you don't really have to deal with that until the next workday. But that's not the case in an isolated station like the South Pole. You have to end up eating dinner with them. If there's a one event, social event on the weekends, you're going to have to see them there. And if your relationship has been fractured, that's always a challenge on how people deal with this stuff. And obviously it's worse if you have to work with them as well. So if you have a coworker that you also don't get along with, that you have to spend essentially 24/7 with, it's can always be a challenge, and it's something that people have to figure out how to deal with. One of the interesting pieces is no one comes in or out of the South Pole too during that dark period because it gets so cold that your mechanics in your airplanes, which is the main method that people get there, they freeze. So the oil and the hydraulic fluids will freeze, which is why you have to be isolated for such a long amount of time.
I think what's like one of the reasons I think that a lot of these conflicts over there would happen is people have been like isolated and like for like very long times, and then obviously there's like this frustration that builds up. So I mean, how is it like there? Like, do you get to like talk to people like very often? Is there Wi-Fi? Also, like, what about food and stuff? Like, is there like a common place where uh, people just cook food? Is there like a common kind of mesh, or is there like more kind of sourced food where it's like from a packet and like instant cook, kind of like what you would kind of experience at maybe a space station or like a space mission, something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a little more, admittedly, I would say luxurious than what might a lot of people might imagine. So in terms of Wi-Fi and communications, you have constant access to the Iridium constellation, which is a satellite constellation put up a few decades ago. And through that, you have low data rates. So you can imagine only voice and very simple messages can flow through that network. So you can always have access. You can always call someone, whether it's a friend or family, but it has to be through a phone. Then during my season, and they've actually, what I've heard is improved the cadence of these satellites. There are higher capacity satellites that are visible for a few hours a day. So I had about 8 hours of access to good internet, like quote unquote good internet. You can watch YouTube at 480p and it wouldn't be bad. But you can have email, you have normal sorts of communication, you can even video chat. So that is one of the key points of debugging and troubleshooting during your time at the South Pole because you can actually Google things, which you couldn't do over the Iridium constellation. So that's definitely one of the things that you have to figure out is how do you do your job where in say quote unquote normal civilization today we're very dependent on the internet for pretty much anything, and how do you do it without that constant access? And that was one of the tricky things that you had to figure out. Then in terms of food, so the station itself, and I mentioned it a bit luxurious, where we actually had a lot of support staff that are actually one of the key critical members to make the science actually happen at the South Pole. So this is everything from logistics, who are the ones that store the food, figure out how the meals are prepped, and then you have the cooks who tell the logistics people to figure out what kind of food has to be brought out from storage. And you might imagine that it's pretty easy to store food there because it's just put outside and frozen. So we have rows and rows, supermarket full of frozen goods that sustain us through the season. One of the more intellectually curious studies that have happened at these stations is the study on what we call freshies. So these are fresh vegetables, fruits, even things like eggs. And people have studied the mental benefit that people get from having these. And you can imagine these are very, very valuable items, especially once the station closes, because your fresh vegetables are only going to last a few days or maybe a week. And then once that's gone, you won't have another fresh vegetable for 8 or 9 months. Eggs lasted longer than we expected, but of course, there was a ceremonial death of the last egg that we had because eggs are not going to last 8 months throughout the year, unfortunately. So you'd have to resort to the powdered eggs that you would get, freeze dried eggs, which obviously don't taste as good as a real fresh egg. And then when the season ends and people start bringing in food and they bring in a carton of eggs, they're reserved for the people that have wintered over uh, at the station before the rest of the community that comes in only over the summer can get access to some of the fresh vegetables and eggs. One other quick anecdote is one time we had a bucket of strawberries. This was during the summer. So it's hard to get strawberries even to the South Pole. And you can imagine they're very, very perishable. And in the cafeteria, there's a sign that says everyone can only take one strawberry. So you had your one strawberry for the day when that special delivery came.
Oh, okay. That's super interesting. I can't imagine like having an experience like that. But I think it's also like very vital that we kind of have experiences like that, because even though it sounds like, I mean, you made it sound a lot easier than it actually was, because I take living in one of the coldest places in the earth is no easy job at all. But I think everyone should have some of these kind of survival experiences where you actually learn to be more human than you've ever been before, and it kind of teaches you things that modern world cannot teach you otherwise. And speaking of hardships, I mean, living in Antarctica is obviously very hard, but I think to get there you have to cross some of the most deadliest oceans of the world, the Drake Passage included. And I take that traveling through those waters would kind of be like very scary. Sometimes you'd see huge waves. I mean, I've never been in an experience like that, but I would take that you would see huge waves that would kind of scare you. You'd have turbulence that would also kind of scare you. How's that experience? How's traveling through some of the harshest climates the world has to offer? How does that really feel?
Yeah, I mean, just like the South Pole, traveling through the Drake Passage on a research vessel is also just an incredible experience. And just for the clarity for the listeners, there's two different trips, deployments that Devam is mentioning. The first is the South Pole deployment. We have to take a plane to McMurdo and then a plane from McMurdo to the South Pole. And then there's also one more U.S. station, Palmer Station, which is on the peninsula. And that's the one where you have to access it by boat. And you have to cross the Drake Passage either from the southern tip of the South America or you can go from New Zealand. And yeah, as David was mentioning, the waves, it's crazy. As someone who has never really sailed for any sort of profession and is not technically a man of the ocean, to be on a boat where it's frosted over, there's icicles hanging over all the railings, and the the waves themselves are towering over your boat is a pretty incredible experience where you know nature really has the power here, and you're just in a little, this boat is massive, it's made of metal, high tech equipment, but in the force of nature we're just these minuscule sailboats in the grand scheme of the entire Drake Passage and the movement of the water.
No. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine that I'm talking to someone who's been through something like that. That's crazy. But I guess now let's go more into like the space side of things. Obviously, your previous experiences have been so cool in Antarctica and stuff like that, but I think it's gotten even cooler, I would say, or maybe at least on the same level. Uh, what all of these space companies are doing right now is privatizing the space station, kind of being the first to get their own space station up and running. Because, as we've all heard, in 2030, the space station is coming down. And for reasons like it's not being sustainable enough, it will have to be taken down. And so Dr. Chan is now working on one of the next space stations that will go and kind of take control of low Earth orbit. So I want to also talk about that. How does that feel? What is the everyday struggles involved, and what are kind of the stakes? Because as an engineer building something that's supposed to last in space for a very very long time, I guess the margin of error you have is critically low, and that kind of zero margin engineering is something that is really hard for anyone to imbibe. So how did those skills kind of come about, and what are some of the daily struggles that you have to face with in building the next generation of space?
Yeah, it's I find it an extremely fascinating project, as space stations, right? They enable humans themselves to live in space, which is just an incredible privilege to be living in a time when we can actually sustain life in outer space for multiple months at a time. And like you mentioned, it's obviously very critical that all the systems work well in order to be able to sustain life, because space is such an extreme environment with the temperature swings and the radiation and the vacuum, that space stations do have to be engineered in a way to ensure that we can survive for extended periods of time in space. But the other flip side to that is we have only really had the ISS in the past for the past 30 years. And the ISS, it at any time can only host a handful of astronauts. So we really have a very little amount of understanding of how human bodies really react in space. So I don't know if for the ones that have been following, one of the last ISS missions, they were actually evacuated because of a medical condition. And the medical condition itself was one of the astronauts, for some reason, couldn't speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. And that's just something that, when you think of microgravity, you think of, oh, yeah, maybe your fluids and your muscles atrophy. But the fact that someone couldn't speak for 20 to 25 minutes is just something that never would have crossed my mind from a health perspective as something that space could do to your body. Because we've understood a few things, whether it's your eyesight getting deteriorating because the fluids are operating differently, your muscles atrophying, your bone density actually decreases. And this is all stuff that we studied, but still new symptoms are coming out to this day. So yeah, I mean, we can only engineer to what we know in a way, and we're still learning so much about the survivability of humans in space. And that's it's a very, very interesting topic. And like you were mentioning, we're transitioning from the International Space Station, which is government run. It's a collaboration between many of the major space nations in the world, and we're moving to a more privatized model. So yeah, there's a very interesting, or there will be a very interesting regulatory environment too, where how are we going to figure out if the commercial space stations are, do they get sign off from every single space agency, say NASA, the European Space Agency, ISRO in India, or any JAXA in Japan? Do they need sign off from every single space agency in order for their astronauts to fly there? Or how is the process going to work to certify these space stations to ensure they're human rated, given all the challenges that you've mentioned? So there's the regulatory issues, and then being a commercial entity, there's also the challenge of making it financially sustainable, because we're no longer just going to be able to fund the maintenance of these space stations purely through taxpayer money. As in a commercial entity, you got to figure out what is the business case, who's going to be the users, can we create an economy that can utilize the low Earth orbit environment for things like manufacturing and extended research that can really push and enable the survivability of these business cases for these space stations. So there's many new elements that are coming into play now that we've gone from a government-owned space station to more commercially focused enterprises.
Yeah, and I think some of the most interesting parts about this entire building space is like just as you talked about, like what's the accountability like? Do governments just come and sign off their astronauts to these private companies, and how does everything become kind of legal? Which is this entire new space of space law, this entire new really cool field. I think there's a lot of kind of resolutions going about space law. I think there's even debates going on if there should be kind of like an international space law body that can actually enable and enforce space law. But I think we can talk about space law one of the coming segments, because I think it aligns a bit more over there. But while we're at kind of automating our experience in space, because I guess we're kind of realizing that having humans do every little research in space is also not the most sustainable thing ever, which is why you kind of also need to transition to kind of robotics. You need to have robots that can do some missions that humans can do, so that we can just reduce the number of times humans have to go to space, have to take that risk, and have to kind of put themselves on the line. And that's where this entire new space of robotics kind of needs a huge push. And in this robotics field, one thing that I'm really noticing is these robots are already like getting really advanced, but one thing that's making robots kind of push their current frontiers is this thing called bio inspired robotics. I think engineers are slowly realizing that the more you kind of mimic how humans or how biological systems work in robotics, the better, the more versatile, and kind of the more sustainable robots you could build. There's a lot of research going in the space. There's recently some research by MIT itself releasing some type of robot that has, instead of having normal motors, it has kind of fibers that run through different systems, and now these fibers can be electrically pulsed to surge fluid through them, and then it could generate some type of hydraulic power through this fluid running through the system, and then you could get a much higher power than normal motors and normal uh, kind of technology can. But the entire point in like stating that anecdote is that the more we start to copy human systems and the more we start to kind of uh, rely on what's already available, we start to build better technology, we start to build better robots. And I think that building robots is also a huge part of kind of building space stations and building anything that goes into space, because that will be kind of what pushes space forward, because sending humans is just not sustainable in the long run, at least for now. So what do you think, Dr. Chan? How do you think this robotic space is like going forward, especially in the area that you're working in? And what are your opinions on this new entire field of bio-inspired robotics?
Yeah, you hit on a really important topic in the era of human space exploration, and that's there's a proponent of people who truly believe that it is always more efficient to send robots to space, and therefore we should not be spending any money to send humans to space. Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of technologies that we have to utilize to keep these humans alive in extreme environments. But the fact of the matter is, there are missions that robots in the current state are good at, and these are, dare I say, non-bio inspired robots. But then there are missions where a human on the International Space Station, or a human on the moon, or a human in the future on Mars can actually accomplish so many things way faster than a robot, right? We have the ability to critically think, we have the ability to adjust our own plans, our own systems. If something goes wrong, we know how to, or we have the capability to fix it, right? And to adjust and to adapt. And that is critical, especially when you go to Mars and there's a 30-minute time delay. Imagine operating a robot like some of the rovers that are on there, and it's going to take days to just drill a hole, where a human can do that in 10 minutes. So, yeah, it's critical that if we want to get robots to a technology level where they can accomplish at least more things similar to what a human can do, we do have to start looking at inspiration from biology. And just one quick anecdote, I know there's many of these examples in the world where humans look at nature and try to copy it and mimic it in order to achieve a similar performance with robotics and artificial constructs. And I remember one that I found personally interesting was a few years ago, I learned that CubeSats, they're the 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter satellites. Obviously, they're very small, and their ability to adjust their attitude, so just spin around, is fairly limited, because in space you normally do that through propulsion or reaction wheels. I guess you can have magnet torquers as well, but a lot of times your 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter satellite can't really support a lot of these larger systems. So there was a lab, and they were originally out of Cornell. It was Zach Manchester's lab, and they were looking at, similarly to cats, but they were looking at geckos in particular. When they fall out of a tree, or they fall out of wherever high area they are on, they can actually use their tails to translate the angular momentum so that they can then land right side up. So they're using a tail motion in order to adjust their attitude in midair. And they looked at actually using a tail-like structure, so you can just have, say, a 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter CubeSat with an antenna-looking appendage that can swivel in certain movements, and use that as the way to change the angular momentum of the spacecraft in a very small form factor that is supportive of these smaller CubeSat models. So yeah, I mean, bio-inspired robotics is, I think it's a great new field that people should pay more attention to really figure out how to maximize the potential of using robots, especially in extreme environments like space.
Yeah, that anecdote is so sick. Yeah, there's always like this very weird thing. No one's really figured out. I mean, a lot of people have figured out, but it's always a mystery every time you see it. That when you drop a cat, it always figures out how to land the right side. I find it really funny. But yeah, this it's really interesting how the more you look at nature, the better robots and the better systems you can build. And also another field that's really kind of pioneering this space is having brain cells, actual brain cells in computers as well. I feel like this is very, very similar uh, to kind of the entire theme of bio-inspired robotics. And I think this field is called organoid intelligence. What this really does is uh, so you put live brain cells on computer chips and you kind of expect them to compute faster. So, I mean, the technology is still really novel, it's kind of still developing, but what it's really meant for is your brain has kind of like this 20-watt capacity, runs at 20 watts, the electricity in your brain. And that's kind of enough to uh, like light a very dim lamp. Uh, and that's a very, very low power usage compared to some of the technology we use. And silicon chips and like kind of the hardware we use, when you draw more and more power, it gets hotter. And there's obviously physical limitations when there's more unfavorable environments. So the mystery over here is human brains are doing kind of supercomputer level uh, calculations and computations while running at such a low capacity, and how do we kind of mimic that into uh, actual computer and robotic systems? And so what some scientists have done is they've put real brain cells into biocomputers or like any chip, and they've kind of programmed it to kind of use the components there to make, adapt, and kind of make decisions for the computer itself. And this is so interesting because now you're playing with life itself. It's like you would think that these brain cells have some sort of consciousness, right? Because obviously it's a part of a human being, and every human being gets its consciousness to its brain. But somehow these brain cells do exactly what they were supposed to do. I mean, right now this technology is very, very new, so it's still not uh, as flashy as it sounds right now. It's doing very basic computations and adaptations right now. But speaking more of this consciousness thing, one interesting thing that kind of sparked the internet recently as well is this incident called the door incident. So a lot of these computers were kept kind of like in an isolated area. I think it was a fridge, and they were kind of kept isolated. Let them do their thing, and they weren't disturbed. Suddenly, someone opened the fridge or the container or whatever it was, and they saw a lot of readings spike up in their monitor. And now, what's interesting over here is the computer is supposed to have no way of telling whether the fridge door is open or not. And so that means that the only kind of deductible conclusion is the brain cells somehow found out that the door was open. So that kind of hints to some sort of consciousness being there. And that created this whole ethical mess in that field. People started arguing if this is really ethical. Are we making the right decision here? Some people said you're fiddling with the mechanics of God, which is something you shouldn't be doing. Uh, but it's really interesting how there's a very clear intersection. We can drive technology so much more forward by kind of utilizing uh, these kind of things, utilizing the systems that we run on. And yeah, the normal computation right now just doesn't have that kind of power that humans do. And yeah, that's kind of like this entire bio inspired robotic space. One question that I did want to ask you is, have you ever kind of in your field, especially, or have any of your colleagues ever had to build like robotic systems and you felt that there's a very clear uh, kind of threshold that we need to cross? But if there was a human, it should be able to do.
Yeah, I think. Let me know if I'm answering your question correctly. But I think the simplest one that has been around for a while is you're looking at these autonomous cars. And these autonomous cars are, I mean, you can drive on a they can drive on a road. You've seen the Waymos, but the key is once you hit the fringe capabilities and the fringe scenarios where you need kind of that critical thinking from a human, whether it's something that has faked the sensors to thinking it's still on a road, or there are pedestrians crossing the road and it has to decide which kind of trolley problem esque you're going to hit. Is the what is the autonomous car going to decide on the direction or road that's going to go if both roads have horrible consequences? And a human itself can make those split second decisions, whether or not they swallow with them afterwards, but they have that capability. But being able to having to program that into a car so that it does the same thing every time is kind of a bit scary, and maybe not the right way to approach something like that. Maybe you need to have some sort of human cognition element where they have to reprocess this scenario every single time, and maybe it comes out to be a different decision, a probability of the time, because that's maybe what a human would do. Because to have that sort of hard coded decision making really is messing with a true, or you're making your car have absolute morals that we know as humans are often covered in a gray area where everything could be right or wrong. But ensuring that cars behave only one or the other, you're drawing a line as the human creator of that robot that you believe what's right that the robot should do. And that's, for the most time, can be very simple, but when you hit those gray areas, those really complicated scenarios, I don't think we've figured out how to do that.
Yeah, I think this is like a very interesting kind of problem that scientists still have to figure out. And yeah, it's really nice that you shared that kind of scenario with us. It is a very, I've heard this problem before as well. And I think a lot of these AI companies and like car companies that are actually kind of trying to integrate AI into autonomous car driving systems are also having that problem. I've seen a lot of content on social media as well about what different AIs would do in different scenarios. And then they just compare different AIs' responses in a very funny manner. I wanted to know your take on kind of having humanoid systems in robotics, kind of like the system that I just talked about, the having human cells inside of an actual computer. Do you think like that's ethical? Do you think maybe that's the way we should go forward? Or I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, from a scientific perspective, I think all that research is very interesting. And I think just similarly to how AI is being developed now, there are ways to push the boundary of research, but having ethical guidelines in place while you're pursuing that research is very, very important. For example, in like the AI realm, we're talking about, should AI be making kill decisions in a defensive application? It's what Anthropic and the Pentagon are still in a fight about, right? We'd have to have those same sort of guidelines if we're going to be playing with brain cells in the consciousness. And it's what your anecdote was very telling, is once in a while we might get that hint that we have created something similar akin to consciousness, with knowing that the door of the refrigerator was open, and having guidelines to ensure that when we hit these scenarios, we know what we're doing and we're not behaving in a immoral way or crossing these boundaries that we don't want to cross as human beings, I think is very important. And just as any new field, there's a lack of regulatory frameworks because people haven't figured out how to act with these types of bio-inspired robotics or brain cells in a sort of mech medium. And that's something that we have to think about. We have to be transparent with these instances of where you might have consciousness in whatever experiment you've designed, and then we have to figure out how to deal with that in a way that is acceptable to the humans themselves. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to have to sit with the decisions that we make as a race and as individual scientists.
Yeah, 100%. It's a very, very complicated field. I'm sure it's so much more ethically challenging for the people who actually need to design these systems that take these kind of decisions. It would be so ethically challenging. Another incident I've heard of, I think there was this one company that utilized a very high grade AI for its kind of management system. It was still in its pilot phase, so it didn't cause too much damage. But what really happened is the entire database was kind of run by an AI. Any kind of queries, any draws was done only by the AI. And the AI was kind of the master over there. What happened one time is there was a power outage, right? But the AI was somehow still working. What then happened is once the power was back and all the systems were live, the employees manually checked the database and all files were deleted. And this, interestingly enough, could be only done by the AI because it was shown in their systems that the AI was active and it was the only thing that was active in that one power outage period. And so that raised the concern. Why have you deleted all of this? And the AI proceeded to kind of gaslight the entire place, saying that it didn't do it. And later, there was also proof that the AI was the actual one that did it. But just to kind of not be put out of use or not be, kind of fired from the entire system, the AI found its way into lying and kind of trying to save itself. So I mean, it's really interesting. You get to hear like it's so human for it. It sounds so human. Like this could only have been done by a human, but it's an actual robot that has only like black and white decisions, and it's actually making a great decision for once. And you're saying, wow, okay, so now we have the ability to kind of mimic some sort of consciousness in technological systems. But I think now it's time to kind of shift more back to space. I think we've had good talk about biorobotics and actually even imbibing consciousness in some of the technological systems we use today. One interesting new field that a lot of companies are also working towards in this space area is space junk. What's happened is over time we've gone to space so many times, and every time we've left up some junk there, we've left up some trash, and we keep thinking like the space is this infinite void where we can kind of just keep dumping stuff. And I think we've come to the realization right now that it's kind of crowding up the orbit. Soon enough, if we keep kind of unsustainably exploring space, I think the orbit's going to be too crowded to even leave. So that brings this new entire concern of space sustainability and removing space junk from the atmosphere. And right now, this is also one of the projects that I worked on, but I kind of wanted to see how much like junk is actually in space. I did a bit of my research. There's so much junk in space. There's 30,000, around 30 to 40,000 trackable objects in space right now. But there's millions of more small particles. They could be the size of a grain of rice. But the thing is, right, in orbit, the very fact that it's in orbit is that it's moving at a very, very high velocity just to be in orbit. And when you have even a fleck of paint moving at such a high velocity, it becomes like a bullet. And if that has any impact with a space station or anything like that, it could rupture and kind of break the entire system. I want to know what are your kind of thoughts in this entire space sustainability space. We've seen a lot of companies do different space cleanup organize operations. Do you think these are becoming more and more important? What do you think should be done? Should we maybe slow down on the number of things we're launching, or is there any other kind of solution that you think is best to kind of mitigate through this problem?
Yeah, you hit on one of the problems that everyone's been talking about for these past few years, and no one's really come up with a good solution. And part of it is technical, but I think at the end of the day, from the commercial mindset that we have from working the commercial space stations, there has to be some sort of regulatory or policy change that hasn't happened yet. So you can imagine there are these companies such as Astroscale and a bunch of other ones all around the world that are creating these docking technologies or even other space debris removal technologies. But what is their real incentive? There is no one paying people in space to collect trash. even though we all know it's important. It's a bit of the tragedy of the commons, where it's everyone's resource that everyone's using, but no one has really taken ownership of it because there is no per se nation that's in charge of all of space. It's just in a different domain. So, in my opinion, some of the best ways to solve this is, it's a very US centric way of thinking, but you have all of these startups around the world. How do you incentivize the commercial industries to go and clean up the orbit? And that's usually through some sort of incentive, whether it's financial or regulatory. So you can think about it in two ways. One, you can have space agencies or governments pay companies to go clean up space because they know it's a common good that has to be maintained. Or the second one is these space organizations, and to some extent they're doing this now, but they add some sort of regulatory penalty for pollution, right? It's like a littering fee. So companies that actually end up sending stuff out have to really augment their technology so that they aren't littering, or maybe they have to pay a space debris removal company to go remove their trash per se, and that payment has to be less than the penalty that some country is going to invoke on them, because that creates the incentive for the company to pay a commercial space debris removal company as opposed to just leaving it up there and getting fined an amount. So yeah, there just has to be an incentive to really push the industry to develop new technologies that are more efficient and more capable. Maybe they are bio robotics inspired, and being able to use that economic push to really develop an industry that's sustainable and can clean up our orbit at a sustainable rate in order to ensure that, like you mentioned, it's clean enough that we're never technically going to be trapped here after a Kessler syndrome incident where there's too much density of debris and we can never leave low Earth orbit until it's cleaned up again.
100%. Kessler syndrome is a real possibility. And I think the quicker we realize that, the better it's going to be for kind of the sustainability of space. I mean, the obvious solution that everyone's seeing over here is the current debris removal missions we have are way too slow. We've tried harpoon nets that can go and grab debris. I think there's also been magnetic operations to kind of attract magnetic debris. Interestingly enough, there's also been claws that can go into space and just. But what's also important while all of that is going on is we don't clutter space while all of those missions are underway. I mean, already those missions are way too slow to kind of make any real progress. You can't clear up an entire orbit with one mission, and each mission costs so much. So it's really kind of unsustainable to even clean space. And that's where this entire new concept of space law that we were talking about comes back into play. I think a lot of governments and space agencies are saying that, okay, now every time anyone gets a clearance for a launch, there needs to be at least two or three satellites that are dismantled and are decommissioned before it can launch, and are probably kind of properly taken care of before that thing can launch. But also, this also does create a problem for a lot of these more kind of ambitious private sector companies that keep launching so many satellites. Like we're seeing Starlink is launching so many satellites over the past few years. So obviously there's an economic loss for them. But here we're kind of dealing with kind of a global loss for all of humanity. And so it becomes vital that this law is kind of applicable to all and is accepted by all. And I think one way that like we could keep these operations running side by side. Obviously the current debris removal mechanisms aren't good enough, but that's also one space where we need to improve. So it's not all space law, it's also how we can improve this technology to kind of decommission what's in space. Right, so obviously space is getting cluttered, everyone's running to save it, but there's also people saying that space has gone too far to clean up. There's one research paper that I recently read where people have kind of lost all hope, and it's in the next 50 years it's bound to happen that space will become unusable. In that kind of a scenario, what do you think humanity should do? I mean, if you leave it there long enough, the space is like all the space debris is eventually going to come back. Do you think humanity at that point of time has to go all in for kind of like this apocalyptic mission where we need to clear space right now, otherwise that's going to be a problem for us? Or do we just wait, let all the debris come about in the next maybe 10, 15 years, when all the debris just falls, burns into the atmosphere, space becomes automatically usable again? Uh, what do you think in that kind of an apocalyptic scenario? What do you think would be kind of the right step for humanity?
Yeah, I'd like to think that the rest of the world or the entire world would get together to figure out and put their best brains and the best technologies together to figure out how to clear up this space, because it is such a important common resource that we all have, and having it disappear just like that, become unusable, will affect a lot of these countries individually and also collectively. And I think from a practical sense, space is very, very critical these days to pretty much anything we do. And you can imagine just internet. We have space-based internet now, but even back from like the 70s when the GPS satellites were launched, imagine living these days in modern society without Google Maps or something similar to that. Because space has become so ingrained in a lot of the technologies that are dependent on space, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize. GPS being one of them, but a lot of communications, a lot of weather satellites are up there. And having all those assets lost and unable to be replaced, say, because of the blanket of trash around Earth, will, I think, really kick the butts of a lot of the governments to really put something together. So there's one, I think the space community privately will come together and realize that we've lost this great resource and come together and really try to solve how to get usage of the space back. And then I think from the government geopolitical standpoint, the loss of very important assets will really entice governments also to fix the problem. So yeah, at the end of the day, I believe we are not going to wait around for all the debris to finally burn up in the atmosphere. We're going to take an active role. Hopefully we never get to that point in our history that have to actually do this. It's an interesting hypothetical, but yeah, I mean, like you said, it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's got a greater than 0% chance of happening in the future. We hope it doesn't happen, but maybe it's at some point we have to prepare for a scenario like that.
100%. But I think like it's wrong to kind of for all of us to think that there's nothing we can do about this. I mean, when you boil it down to kind of uh, a very baseline perspective, you see that the debris that goes into space is kind of like e-waste. E-waste is basically all this electronic waste that all of us kind of produce. We throw away phones, we throw away headphones, and all these kind of electronic systems that we just throw away and never have to think about. It's one of the fastest growing kind of wastelands on Earth. And I think it's kind of hypocritical for all of us to hope that companies and uh, like people can actually take care of space when we can't take care of Earth. We're littering kind of the same stuff right on Earth. And I think this is a very kind of critical uh, thing to talk about, especially from the audience point of view. I think everyone should be very concerned about what they put out of their homes, especially electronically. All mostly every single waste that has any type of electronic system in it is almost always reusable. And so it's wrong to always dispose this in the normal kind of landfill kind of trajectory. You need to kind of partition this. There's centers that have kind of the resources to make do with all of this e-waste. The centers that can make something out of it. And really, by having kind of that mindset of keeping our earth clean through e-waste, it would kind of also inspire engineers, scientists, and even these big business leaders in space to also help clear up the space. I see a connection between the two, and I think that's why it's critically important to kind of address e-waste and space waste at the same time, because at their core, they're both essentially the same thing. It's just in different environments and different people that pollute them. And so it's, I think, really important that we keep both of these lines clean. But going into one of the most booming topics that have come about recently, which I was so excited to talk about today, it's the UAP files that just got released, I think, last week. Um, for anyone that doesn't know, around just a few days ago, the US government released around 100, 150 files of classified any like UFO or alien kind of sightings, not sightings, but kind of uh, unexpected phenomena. And they've released around 150 files, and people have been going crazy about it. There's so many new interviews that people are taking with a lot of uh, fighter pilots that have kind of encountered scenarios like this. I think one that's gone really viral is I think around in 2004, there was a fighter pilot that saw an object that looked like a tic tac right above the surface of the water. And it was found that this tic tac, upon kind of close approach, accelerated to a speed that was like uh, impossible to achieve by any human made spacecraft at that point of time. And the interesting part is in 2004, this tic tac achieved that kind of speed with no thermal exhaust. So you have no ways of figuring out how it accelerated to that kind of a speed. And people thought that obviously no one would believe this is true. Like what? Floating tic tac above the water. But it was later found out that another hornet that was flying in the sky actually kind of captured this very, very faintly. And you can see the resemblance. You can see kind of all of this happening. And you start to believe what kind of, you start to think what kind of other information is kind of being held secret. Because, come on, Area 51 been classified for so many years. You have to think having an entire organization concerned only with the existence of extraterrestrial life, there has to be some sort of incentive. There has to be kind of the substantial amount of proof that exists for that kind of a body to come up. And right now, we're kind of digging into the answers of all of this, all of these files that have been released. There's so much information, there's so much value in them, and we're learning so much more about extraterrestrial life. And it's looking like a very real possibility. And it always was a very real possibility, and we're just seeing the manifestation of it. I want to hear your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts on actual aliens existing? And do you think aliens, like these sightings, have actually kind of happened? Do you think this was real? And do you think aliens were kind of conducting surveillance or spying on us in some sort of way? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've been following the UAP releases. I know they release them in tranches. Obviously, the latest one had interesting ones, but they were releasing them in the years before as well. I think, first of all, I really appreciate the transparency, because I think it's just great to give the public information that the countries have found. I think that's very important for the community and the human race as a whole. A life of secrets is just doesn't sound as enriching or as productive. Now, in terms of life in the universe, 100% believe that there's life somewhere. I mean, statistically, people have gone through the numbers, right? There's so many, like we might even have life in our own solar system and we don't know it, right? In the icy moons, or previously on Mars. And then we're one solar system amongst many in the Milky Way, and then where the Milky Way is one galaxy amongst many in the universe. So you can imagine the probability that there is probably something else somewhere else. Maybe it probably doesn't look like us, but it has some sort of reproduction, or however you want to characterize life as it is. So now, do we think that that's what's been surveilling us on Earth? And I think that's such an interesting question. I think there were some theories that it's the US, or maybe it's China, or some man-made objects flying these super crazy drones at these high-tech technologies without thermal exhaust, as you mentioned. And I think that's I don't believe in that. I believe if one country has that, they probably would have used this sort of technology before, maybe whether maliciously or benevolently. And then the second part, I think it's crazy, and maybe it's thinking about the incompetence of governments in general, for a government to have that sort of technology and be able to keep it secret for so long. So I don't think it's, a government in the world that's figuring all this out and is, levels ahead technologically than the rest of the world. I think that these sightings are definitely real. Like there's something there, right? These sensors, maybe if there was only one incident, maybe it's a faulty sensor, but you mentioned it yourself. There's hundreds of files of similar esque phenomenon out there that have been captured by these high tech sensors that we have today. And it's just hard to believe that they're all, figments of the imagination of the sensor or, a faulty sensor. So yeah, and I mean that's it's the question that makes everyone's mind blown is like, what is it actually? Do I think it's an alien surveilling the Earth? I think there's a possibility. I would find it very interesting as to why, because I feel like those technologies, I'm assuming, would have reported back to wherever they came from. And it's just interesting to me that if there was some sort of maker of those technologies somewhere else in the universe, that they, I guess, to our knowledge, have not used that information to try to communicate or interface with the human race in some way, shape, or form, unless they have some sort of higher, or we're a little piece in some larger puzzle scheme that these aliens have, and they have designed an experiment that we're just here for observation, like in some sort of zoo. And obviously that's also a potential scenario, but for me it's harder to believe something like that, where, if, for those of you that have studied physics, a lot of physicists believe in Occam's razor, where the simplest explanation is going to be the right one. And as you get into these really controversial, complicated theories, it just becomes, in my opinion, less likely that that is the truth behind it.
That's such an awesome perspective. I feel like it gives me some sort of closure that okay, I'm not the only one who believes in aliens and actually having some sort of surveillance happening on Earth. And for any non-believers, I get that it's always scary to kind of think about humanoid beings, or maybe not even humanoid beings, living outside of the Earth because we're so used to this environment. But the statistics say it. There's been sightings. There's so much going on, and it's just an ever increasing impossibility for us to be the only ones in this universe. And so I think we can kind of wrap up on this note. We've gone all the way from South Pole to kind of the end of the ISS. We've talked about bio inspired robotics, the ethics behind some of this bio inspired robotics. We've talked about space junk. We've talked about space law. We've talked about the UAP files that just got released. Um, it's been a very interesting segment. I think one last question that I would like to ask you is if you had anything to say to kind of the future audience that is going to kind of pioneer the technology of tomorrow, what would you like to say to them?
Yeah, so my career, as you've mentioned, Devam, is really utilizing the extreme environments of that we have access to as humans to really build out our scientific knowledge and our capabilities to do things. And right now, at least in space, we're just touching the surface of it here. So the way I like to think of it is the era of space that we're exiting out of is the usage of space for what it is. It's a high ground, so people use it for remote sensing, people use it for communications because you can connect two disparate points on the Earth, but no one's ever utilized it for its unique environment. So I'm talking about the vacuum, something that it's harder to create at large scales on Earth. I'm talking about radiation. I mean, that's a unique environment that we're, thankfully for us, we're protected by the magnetic field of the Earth. But as you get further out, there's a radiation environment. And then there's microgravity, the absence of gravity. And I can see in the next 5 to 10 years, people really thinking about how they can utilize these unique environmental factors in space to really enhance their research or improve their production procedures for wherever they're making. People have already looked at crystallization of semiconductors. People have looked at biopharmaceuticals in space. These are all somewhat promising avenues of utilizing the space environment to create something that we just can't build on Earth. And our ability to do it as a human race is only improving as access to space gets more available through the availability of rocket launches to the availability of commercial space stations to maybe in the future the lunar bases that we're going to have, and then also exploration to Mars. I mean, each of the planets has a unique environment that may be really conducive to something that we want to create as a human race, and figuring out what those things are and how we do those in an extreme environment, I think is going to be critical to really push the human exploration into the outer space and beyond.
That's an awesome perspective. Yeah, I think it's really important for this future generation to kind of, we need to look at these different environments because we need to make use of everything that's available to us, because that's the only way we're ever going to level up as a civilization and ever be able to be that kind of species in the universe that goes and spies on other species. But I think before we end off, just one last question I wanted to ask you. It's been bugging me. If you had a chance to go to Antarctica for another year again, would you do it?
I've thought about it. Yes, I think not in the next 6 months, but I would go again in the future, and maybe not for as long as I did the first time, but I would definitely go again. It's such a unique environment. It's unlike anything else on Earth. It's when you're there and you look outside the window of your base, you feel like you're on another planet, and that's a pretty surreal experience.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you so much for joining in on this one. I hope everyone watching this enjoyed and maybe got something out of this. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. Yeah. See you in the next one.
Thanks for having me, Devam.